On the top floor of Sterling Crest Holdings, dozens of executives raised their glasses to Vanessa Cole's promotion to chief executive. Then she crossed the room and poured a full glass of champagne over Caleb Mercer's head. The room exploded with laughter. Some pointed, others lifted their phones to record the wine running down his suit. Vanessa smiled, certain the last rival standing between her and total control had finally been put in his place. Caleb wiped his face, looked at her, and asked evenly, "Are you sure you want everyone to remember tonight this way?" Why was he so calm? Sterling Crest Holdings occupied 40 floors of glass in the middle of the financial district, and on paper it was worth just under $20 billion. Investment technology logistics. Dozens of subsidiaries scattered across the country, some of them older than the building itself. People who worked there liked to say the company had never really been run by the person whose name was on the door of the executive suite, and for most of them, that was just cynicism. For a few, it was something closer to an observation. Vanessa Cole had spent 11 years working her way toward that door. She started in corporate development, moved into operations, then spent 4 years cleaning up a distribution arm that 2 men before her had failed to fix. She was good. Everyone agreed she was good. What they said more quietly was that she kept score, and that the ledger she kept had no forgiveness column in it. When the board voted, it was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Vanessa Cole would be the next chief executive of Sterling Crest Holdings. She heard the news in a conference room on the 38th floor, thanked the directors with the exact amount of humility the moment required, and walked out into the corridor, where she allowed herself one long breath. This was the largest thing she had ever won. Caleb Mercer had been in the room when the vote was announced. He was the vice president of strategy, and he had held the title long enough that most people had stopped asking how he got it. What they knew about him was almost entirely professional. He fixed things. When a subsidiary was bleeding, when an acquisition was collapsing at the closing table, when a partner threatened to walk, Caleb was the one who flew out and came back 3 days later with a signed page. What they did not know about him was everything else. He did not talk about where he came from. He did not post photographs. He did not drink much at company functions, and he never mentioned family. Colleagues who had worked beside him for 6 or 7 years could not have told you the name of the town he grew up in. It was not rudeness. It was a door that had been quietly closed a long time ago and never opened again, and after a while, people stopped knocking. The surname registered with a few people early on, and then stopped registering. Mercer was a common enough name, common enough that 2 of them appeared on the internal directory in the legal department alone. Richard Mercer had not held an operating role in 12 years, sat as non-executive chairman, and came to headquarters perhaps 3 times a year for board sessions that most of the leadership team never saw. Anyone who had briefly wondered had answered themselves with the obvious answer, which was that a man related to the chairman would not have spent 6 years flying to distressed subsidiaries in the Midwest. 2 members of the board treated Caleb with a deference nobody could quite account for. Helen Whitaker, who had sat on that board for 19 years and had a reputation for treating executives like weather. She had already survived, listened when he spoke, and said so out loud. That kind of thing was noticed. In a building where access was currency, Caleb had access nobody could trace to a source. That was what Vanessa could not stand. Before the vote, she had believed Caleb was the only person in the company capable of taking the chair from her. His proposals came back from the board with fewer marks on them. When one of her cost initiatives created a problem 3 levels down, the managers did not escalate it to her. They walked to his office and closed the door. She learned about half of her own operational failures secondhand, from him phrased in a way that never once sounded like an accusation, which somehow made it worse. Vanessa did not read any of that as competence. She read it as a threat. Competence was something she could measure and outwork. A man that people went to instead of her was something else entirely, and she had spent 2 years watching him with the specific attention of someone building a case she had not yet decided to file. And then the board voted, and it was over. The chair was hers. Whatever contest she had been running in her head against Caleb Mercer, she had won it, and she wanted him to know. The celebration was held that same evening on the top floor in the long room with the wall of windows that looked north over the river. It was supposed to be a private gathering for the leadership team. Catering set up along one side at a bar at the far end, and a view that made everything look like it had already been decided in their favor. By 9 o'clock, it had stopped being a corporate function. The music got louder. The bar staff stopped bothering to ask what people wanted and just kept pouring. Somewhere in the second hour, the gathering completed its transformation into something older and simpler, which was a group of people who had all just discovered they were standing on the winning side and who wanted to enjoy the feeling in front of one another. Caleb stayed near the windows for most of it. He had one glass and did not finish it. Helen Whitaker found him there around 10, and they talked about the fourth quarter for a while, which was, she noted dryly, the only conversation in the room that was actually about the company. She was 61. She had outlasted 4 chief executives, and she had already decided she did not like the sound the room was making. The game started near the bar. One of the vice presidents suggested truth or dare, and it should have died there the way bad ideas usually die among adults with equity packages. Instead, it caught because Vanessa laughed at it, and because everyone in that room had spent the last 6 hours learning to laugh at whatever Vanessa laughed at. Marcus Reed lost a round. He was the head of Corporate Operations 44, with the specific looseness of a man who had backed the right candidate and knew it. He held his hands up and asked for the dare, and the group turned to Vanessa, because by then, the group turned to Vanessa for everything. She took her time with it. Then she said that Marcus should choose someone in the room and pour his champagne over their head. The laughter came fast, the loud, unstable kind that people produce when they are relieved that a dare has landed on someone else. Marcus scanned the room, playing it up, and the room played along until Vanessa's eyes went to the windows and stayed there. Marcus followed her line of sight and understood immediately. His face changed by a very small amount. Caleb Mercer was not a junior analyst. He was a senior executive of the company. He was standing quietly with a glass he had barely touched. And whatever the room thought was funny, there was going to be a version of this story that got told in the morning. Marcus hesitated. Vanessa laughed at him for it. "If you don't have the nerve," she said, "I'll do it myself." She took the glass out of his hand. She crossed the room, and people moved out of her way because at that hour, in that mood, they would have moved out of the way of anything. Caleb watched her come. He did not step back, and he did not set his own glass down, which somehow made the moment worse for everyone watching because it removed the possibility that he had not seen it coming. She raised her arm and poured the entire glass over his head. For 1 second, the room was completely silent. The music kept playing. Champagne ran through Caleb's hair, down the side of his face, into the collar of his shirt, and across the shoulder of a suit that had been pressed that morning. He blinked once against the sting of it. Then the laughter broke, and it was enormous. Somebody near the bar actually applauded. Phones came up, 4 or 5 of them, held at chest height in the way people hold a phone when they want to record something without appearing to record it. Marcus laughed hardest of anyone, because relief and cowardice sound almost exactly like delight. Vanessa turned to the room with her arms slightly open the way a performer accepts a response. "It's a game," she said. "Everybody relax." She said the word game, but nobody in the room, including her, was confused about what had just happened. It was in her face. This was not a dare that had gotten out of hand. This was a debt she had been carrying for 2 years and had finally publicly collected on. Helen Whitaker did not laugh. She set her drink down on the nearest surface with a small, deliberate sound and stood very still, and a handful of others near her went quiet too. But only quiet. Not one of them said anything. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He took a napkin from the table beside him and wiped his face and his neck unhurried. And while he did it, he looked at the room. He looked at Marcus Reed still laughing. He looked at the 4 people holding phones. He looked at the 2 vice presidents by the window who had worked with him for 6 years and were now laughing into their sleeves. He looked at the man from legal who had come to his office in March, asking for help, which Caleb had given him. He went around the room and he took each face in turn, and he did not seem angry, which was the part several of them would remember later, at a time when it had become very important to remember it correctly. He was not planning anything. He was simply recording it. Then he looked at Vanessa and he wiped the last of it from his jaw, and he asked her quite evenly whether she was sure she wanted everyone to remember this night in this particular way. The question did not sound like a threat. That was the problem with it. A threat would have given her something to push against. Instead, it hung in the air like a note somebody had left on her desk, and for a moment Vanessa's smile lost a little of its shape before she found it again. "I'm sure," she said. Helen reached him first near the elevator bank in the corridor, where the music was only a vibration through the wall. She told him to go home. She told him that she would put it in writing to the board herself, that she had witnessed it, that there were at least 4 recordings of it, and that on any reading of the company's own conduct policy, this was actionable before it was anything else. Caleb thanked her. Then he told her he was not going to file anything, and he was not leaving the party. Helen studied him with the expression of a woman who had spent 19 years learning to tell the difference between pride and calculation. "This isn't a small thing," she said. "If you let it pass tonight, it becomes the baseline. Whatever she does next, she'll measure it against this and decide it's reasonable." "I know," Caleb said, "and you're going to let her. I'm going to let her show me." Helen told him she was not comfortable sitting on it. He asked her to hold the report and give it 30 days. She agreed to that much, and no further on one condition, which she stated precisely: if there was a second incident of any kind, she would file immediately, and she would not consult him first. Caleb accepted the condition without argument, and some part of her had already understood that the person in the most danger that night was not the man with champagne in his collar. Vanessa came looking for him 20 minutes later. She found him back inside near the windows, jacket off, and folded over his arm shirt still damp across one shoulder, in conversation with 2 people from the logistics division who had not laughed and now could not decide where to put their eyes. She came close enough that no one else could hear. She told him quietly that the period in which he had been able to make her uncomfortable was over. She told him that she was the chief executive now, and he was a subordinate, and that this was not an insult. It was simply the structure. Then she told him that if he did not care for the way she intended to run the company, resignation was available to him at any hour of any day, and she would sign the paperwork personally. Caleb listened without interrupting. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not wet and his jaw was not tight, and it unsettled her more than anger would have. What she could not see was the calculation he was actually running. He had 2 choices in front of him, and he knew exactly what each one cost. He could respond now. He could escalate it, make it formal, make it personal, and within a week, it would be a fight between 2 executives that the board would have to referee, and everyone in the building would file it under ambition. Vanessa would be careful for a year. She would learn nothing, and she would still be there. Or he could go silent and stay, and let a woman who believed there was no longer a single person in that building with the power to stop her find out what she did with that belief. He had watched what she did that night, when she thought the only thing at stake was a joke. He wanted to see what she would do when she thought nobody was watching at all. "Understood," he said. Vanessa waited for more. There wasn't any. She walked away with the strong sense that she had won, and the faint, unlocatable sense that she had been agreed with rather than beaten. The recordings started moving before midnight. 2 of them went out that same night to people who had not even been at the party. Caleb was in the building the following morning at 7:20, which was 8 minutes earlier than his usual. He had a fresh suit. He carried the same worn leather folder he always carried. He said good morning to the security desk, asked by name, took the elevator to 34, and sat down to the logistics review he had been scheduled to run that week. At 9, 3 separate people found reasons to walk past his glass wall to see whether he was actually there. He was. He did not mention the party. He did not mention Vanessa. When a director from the transport subsidiary asked awkwardly whether he was all right, Caleb said he was fine and asked her about the Ohio yard contract, and after a moment, she answered, and the moment passed. By the end of that first day, the interpretation had settled across 2 floors like weather. He had taken it. He had absorbed a public humiliation from the new chief executive and come back the next morning as though it had not happened, which meant one of 2 things, and the building chose the easier one. It meant Caleb Mercer knew where he stood now. Vanessa believed it more completely than anyone. She had spent 2 years assembling a picture of a rival, and she had been prepared for him to fight, to complain, to go to the board, to resign in a way designed to embarrass her. What she had not prepared for was compliance, and compliance was the one response she had no ability to read. So she read it the way that flattered her. She decided that silence was surrender. That was the first mistake she made, and it was not the expensive one. The expensive one came from what the first mistake permitted her to believe next, which was that the building now contained no door. She could not open. No person. She could not move, and no consequence that could reach her. She began to run the company on that assumption within the week. The restructuring memo went out on the 9th day. It was 3 pages long, and it read to anyone outside the building like an ordinary consolidation of reporting lines. Inside the building, it read like a list. 4 division heads were moved sideways into roles with titles that sounded lateral and were not. 2 regional directors were given early retirement packages generous enough to discourage them from talking about why. The common thread was not performance, because 2 of the 4 had the strongest numbers in their segments. The common thread was that all of them had at some point in the previous 2 years told Vanessa Cole no in a room with other people in it. Marcus Reed kept corporate operations and picked up the entire transport portfolio in the same memo, which roughly doubled the territory reporting to him. He accepted it with a public modesty that fooled nobody and did not need to. He had chosen a side in a room full of people holding phones, and he was being paid for it in exactly the currency he had expected. Caleb's name appeared nowhere in the memo. His title did not change, and his compensation did not change. What changed was the calendar. The Monday strategy session, which he had run for 6 years, moved to a time he was not invited to. The subsidiary review committee lost him from its distribution list. Within 3 weeks, he had gone from a man whose signature appeared on every major transaction to a man who learned about transactions from the internal announcement feed like everybody else. The video circulated in that same period. It was a 19-second clip, shot from behind and slightly to the left, and it caught everything, including the applause. It moved through the company the way those things move forwarded once as a joke, and then 20 times as evidence that the joke was safe to make. Caleb became a subject, not openly and never to his face, but in the small, permanent way that follows a person down a corridor. Conversations adjusted themselves half a second before he entered a room. A junior analyst on 31 made a champagne remark in a group chat that included 40 people and was not disciplined for it, and everyone noticed that too. The people who had respected him did the arithmetic and arrived at the same answer. Standing near Caleb Mercer was now expensive. The transport director who had asked if he was all right stopped coming by. The man from legal he had helped in March sent one email apologizing for nothing in particular and then sent nothing else. 6 years of goodwill evaporated in under a month, and it did not require anyone to be cruel. It only required everyone to be careful. Vanessa did not let the moment go to waste. In a leadership briefing at the end of that month, She referred to the party without naming it, in the middle of a passage about accountability, and said that at Sterling Crest, people needed to understand where they stood. She said it lightly. Several people laughed. She let the laugh run its length before she moved to the next slide, and that was the point of the whole exercise. Caleb kept working. He arrived at 7:20. He ran what he was still permitted to run. He wrote the reports he was still required to write, and he wrote them exactly as well as he had written them a year earlier, which a small number of people noticed and said nothing about. He also began to see the shape of what she was doing to the company, and it was worse than what she was doing to him. The plan was called Redline internally. Vanessa intended to sell Meridian Freight Systems, a logistics subsidiary in the Midwest that had lost money in 6 of the last 8 quarters and looked on any single page of financials like an obvious amputation. Selling it would take a persistent loss off the consolidated statement and put roughly $400 million on the balance sheet in the same period. Her first full year as chief executive would open with a clean number and a decisive story. Caleb had spent 2 weeks inside Meridian's operation 18 months earlier, and he knew what was buried in it. The losses were real, and they were almost entirely a legacy fleet problem. What did not appear anywhere on the income statement was a routing and load optimization system that Meridian's engineering group had been quietly building for 4 years, along with the patents underneath it, and more valuable than either the terminal network the system was designed to run on. 2 of the 3 largest freight brokerages in the country had approached Meridian about licensing in the last year and been told the technology was not for sale. The bidder now offering to buy Meridian was a holding company whose ownership resolved after 3 layers into one of those same brokerages. They were not buying a failing carrier. They were buying the thing the failing carrier was standing on top of, and they were buying it at a price that reflected the fleet. He wrote it up. 22 pages with the patent filings, the licensing approaches, the ownership trace, and a 5-year projection under 2 scenarios. It was the most careful document he had produced in years, and he wrote it knowing precisely who would read it and how she would feel while reading it. Vanessa did not get past the 4th page. She saw the recommendation, she saw the name at the bottom, and she understood it as what it was in her framework, which was a man who had been publicly instructed where he stood and had chosen to stand somewhere else anyway. She sent it back through her assistant with a single line on the cover sheet, saying that strategy would be consulted when strategy was required. The quarterly leadership meeting was held in the large conference room on 38, with the divisional heads and 4 members of the board present, and it was the last scheduled forum in which the Meridian decision could be formally questioned before the transaction moved to signing. Caleb had 11 minutes on the agenda at the end for an item listed as strategic review. Nobody expected anything from it. He used 9 of them. He put up the patent filings first, then the 2 licensing approaches with dates, then the ownership trace with the intermediate entities named. Then he put up the number arranged for what the terminal network and the routing system would be worth to the acquirer within 4 to 6 years against the $400 million Sterling Crest was about to receive for all of it. The low end of the range was $1.8 billion. The room changed. It was not dramatic. It was the sound of a dozen senior people simultaneously deciding to look at the screen instead of at the chief executive. One of the 4 directors present asked Caleb a question about the patent expiry schedule, which was a technical question, and technical questions from directors were how boards signaled that they had started to take something seriously. Helen Whitaker asked whether the licensing approaches had been disclosed in the transaction materials. Caleb said they had not. She wrote something down. Vanessa watched 3 of her own directors lean forward, and what she felt was not doubt about the transaction. What she felt was the chair moving under her. 11 years, and it had been hers for less than 2 months, and the same man was doing the same thing he had always done, which was to be more right than her, in front of people who mattered. She did not attack the analysis. She could not. And some part of her knew she could not. which is why she went where she went. She thanked Caleb for what she called his enthusiasm. She said that she was going to be direct with the room because the room deserved directness. Then she brought up the party. She said that some people had found the evening in question amusing, and some had not, but that she had assumed a senior executive would be capable of understanding what it communicated. She said she was beginning to think the message had not landed. She said it seemed that Caleb still had not quite worked out who runs this company. A few people laughed, not many. Marcus laughed, and 2 others laughed because Marcus did, and the sound was thinner than it had been on the top floor, and everybody in the room heard how thin it was. Vanessa announced that the strategy office was being removed from the Meridian transaction entirely, and that Marcus Reed would carry it to close with full authority. She said it in the tone of an administrative note. Caleb did not sit down, and he did not raise his voice. He asked her one question. He asked whether if her decision cost Sterling Crest billions of dollars in long-term value. She was prepared to answer for it to the person who actually owns this company. Vanessa laughed. It came out easily because to her, the question was not even clever. Ownership at Sterling Crest was institutional, diffuse, a matter of index funds and pension vehicles, and a founding family that had spent 2 decades gradually stepping back. There was no person. There was a cap table. "If whoever that is has a problem," she said, "tell him to come see me." Caleb closed his folder and said one word, "Fine." He said it the way a man closes an account, rather than the way a man surrenders one. Helen Whitaker looked up at him from the far end of the table, and for the first time since the night of the party, she looked genuinely alarmed, though not for him. That evening, she filed the report she had agreed to hold. She copied 3 directors and the general counsel, and she did not tell Caleb she had done it. From that afternoon forward, the 2 of them were no longer fighting the same fight. Vanessa was fighting for her position. Caleb had stopped fighting altogether and had begun quietly to document. She decided within the week that Caleb had to be gone before the next full board meeting. The Meridian signing was scheduled for the 28th of the following month. If he was still an officer of the company when the directors convened, he would have standing to force the item onto the agenda, and she had seen the room lean forward once already. She started with human resources. She asked for a complete review of his file going back to his first day, and she asked for it discreetly. The file came back almost sterile. No complaints in either direction. No expense irregularities in years of travel that had taken him across a dozen countries. Every performance review in the top band, several of them signed by directors rather than by his nominal supervisor. The personal section was thin to the point of strangeness. Emergency contact listed as a law office rather than an individual, no prior employer references, no education verification on file because someone above the human resources function had waived it before he started. Vanessa read the signature line on 2 of the reviews twice. The surname sat there in front of her, and she looked directly at it and decided it meant nothing because the alternative was that she had spent 2 years in a war with someone whose position she had fundamentally misunderstood, and there was no version of that thought she was willing to finish. A man with that name and that connection would have been running a division by 30. She filed the thinness under privacy, and privacy under arrogance, and moved on. Perfect files should have made her cautious. Instead, they made her impatient. So she changed instruments. If there was no misconduct in the record, she would create a record. She opened a formal internal matter alleging that Caleb had deliberately undermined an approved strategic decision of the chief executive, had solicited directors outside the governance process, and had created factional division within the leadership team. The language was careful. It was drafted to sound like governance rather than revenge, and on paper, it very nearly did. Marcus Reed provided a written statement confirming that Caleb had circulated unauthorized analysis in an attempt to reverse a decision that had already been made. It was technically accurate and completely dishonest, and he signed it 12 days after receiving the transport portfolio in under 4 minutes, because by that point, His own position was welded to hers, and he understood the physics of it perfectly. 3 others signed statements as well. All 3 had been in the room on the top floor. All 3 had laughed. Helen Whitaker asked for a meeting and got 20 minutes. She told Vanessa plainly that she was building a case against a man whose only documented offense was being right, in writing that 4 directors had now read his meridian analysis, and that if the transaction closed and the analysis turned out to be correct, every document Vanessa was currently generating would be read back to her in a room she did not control. She also said something Vanessa did not answer. She said that in her time on that board, she had never once seen anyone move against Caleb Mercer, and that she had always assumed there was a reason for it. Vanessa thanked her for her perspective and said the matter was already in process. She had reached the stage that power reaches in certain people where the building itself feels like an extension of the body. Every door opened. Every request was granted. Every silence was read as agreement. She had begun to mistake compliance for consensus, which is the most expensive error available to an executive, and there was no longer anyone in her orbit willing to charge her for it. Caleb took a call on a Tuesday evening alone in his office with the lights off and the city going on below him. He did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. The voice on the other end asked him one question, which was whether he was certain he wanted to let this go as far as it was going. Caleb answered that he wanted to see what they would do when they believed nobody was watching. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then the man said that he would be there when it was time and that Caleb should understand there would be no partial version of this. Once it started, it would go all the way through, and a number of people would not survive it. Caleb said he understood. Neither of them said the other's name. The special session was called for 4 o'clock on a Thursday on the top floor, in the room with the north windows. It was the same room. Nobody remarked on it, and everybody registered it. Vanessa opened without preamble. She announced that Caleb Mercer was suspended, effective immediately, pending the conclusion of an internal investigation into insubordination and conduct damaging to the interests of the company. She said the phrase "conduct" damaging to the interests of the company twice, because it was the phrase her counsel had approved. She asked for his badge. Marcus set a cardboard box on the table in front of Caleb and told him he could collect his personal items under supervision. A few people laughed. Not the whole room this time, only 4 or 5, and Caleb noted without any particular emotion that they were the same faces. The man from legal, 2 of the vice presidents from the windows, Marcus, of course, who had now laughed at him twice in the same room and had built his entire year on it. Vanessa came around the end of the table and stopped in front of him close enough to be personal and loud enough not to be private. "This time it isn't a joke, Caleb," she said. Caleb unclipped his badge from his jacket and set it on the table between them. He did not slide it toward her. He simply set it down and left it there. By any reading available in that room, it was finished. He had lost his title, his access, his standing, and the last of the people who had once worked beside him. He had spent 6 weeks being reduced in public, and this was the floor. At the door, he turned back and looked at her. "You're right," he said. "This time it isn't a joke." He walked out at 4:20. The elevator doors closed on a room that had already started talking. 9 minutes later, every phone on that floor received the same automated notice from the office of the chairman. Richard Mercer was en route to headquarters and had called an emergency session of the full board of directors, all members in person, within the hour. Vanessa read it twice. Then she smiled because there was only one reason she could imagine for the chairman to be coming in on a Thursday evening, and she had just spent 6 weeks building the file for it. Vanessa spent half an hour preparing. She had her assistant print the internal matter file in 5 copies tabbed and bound with Marcus Reed's statement, and the 3 supporting statements at the front, and the suspension memorandum on top. She reviewed her opening in her head twice. A chairman who comes in on a Thursday evening wants a problem removed, and she intended to be the person who had already removed it. The directors came in from wherever they had been. Some of them had clearly left dinner. Helen Whitaker arrived early, took a seat halfway down the table, and did not speak to anyone, which several people noticed. Richard Mercer entered at 10 minutes past 5, with the company's general counsel Gerald Ashford on his left and 2 additional directors behind him. He was 73 years old, and he had not held an operating role in 12 years, and the room still stood up. He did not sit. He walked the length of the table, stopped near the head of it, and looked down at one particular chair, which was empty. "Where is Caleb?" he asked, though he had known the answer before his car reached the building and asked it anyway so that the answer would be given out loud in front of everyone by the person who had made it true. Vanessa answered with the confidence she had prepared. She said that she had suspended him that afternoon pending an internal investigation, and that the file was in front of every director, and that she was prepared to walk the board through the grounds. Richard did not look at the file. He looked at the empty chair for a few seconds longer, then at the window, then back at her. "Who approved that decision?" he asked. "I did," Vanessa said. "I'm the chief executive." Richard let that sit in the room. He looked around the table slowly at Marcus Reed, at the 2 vice presidents from the windows, at the man from legal, at every face that had signed something or laughed at something in the past 6 weeks. It was the same sweep Caleb had made across the same room on the night of the party, and 1 or 2 people were far enough along in their understanding to recognize it. Then he told them the thing that almost nobody in the operating structure of Sterling Crest Holdings knew. Caleb Mercer was his son, his only son. He had joined the company at 26 on one condition, which was that no one below the board would be told, and Richard had kept that condition for every one of the years since. The room did not react at first, because information of that size does not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces. The deference from 2 directors that nobody could source. The performance review signed above his level, a personnel file with no references, and a law office as the emergency contact. The reason a man who had fixed half the subsidiaries on the eastern seaboard had never once mentioned his family. Vanessa's face did not move. Underneath it, 6 weeks of her own decisions were being rapidly reread in a new light, and every one of them was worse than it had been 10 seconds earlier. Richard was not finished. He told the board that his succession planning had been complete for some time, and that Gerald Ashford could confirm the instruments. The Mercer family's controlling block, together with the voting rights attached to it, would transfer to Caleb on Richard's departure from the chairmanship. It was not a proposal, and it was not subject to a vote. It had been documented years ago and reviewed twice since. Gerald Ashford said from the end of the table that the structures were in place, and had been for some time, and that he had personally reviewed them in the spring. The arithmetic completed itself in every head in the room at approximately the same moment. The man Vanessa Cole had poured champagne over in front of dozens of people, then isolated, then removed from his own project, then mocked in a leadership meeting, then suspended in this exact room with a cardboard box on the table in front of him, was the man who would control a company worth just under $20 billion. He had never been competing for her chair, not once in 2 years. She had built the entire war inside her own head, and she had done it against someone who had never wanted the thing she was defending, because he had something structurally larger and had chosen for reasons that were now visible to everyone to say nothing about it. Marcus Reed had lost all the color in his face and was looking at a point on the table roughly a foot in front of his own hands. Caleb was asked to return. He came up from the lobby where he had been sitting for the better part of an hour, and he came in without the badge which he had left on that table and did not pick up. Nobody laughed. He took the chair that had been empty. He set the same worn leather folder in front of him and did not open it right away. Vanessa spoke first, and she made the only move she had, which was to reframe the beginning. She said that the evening in question had been a game that it had been played among consenting adults after a long day, that champagne had been involved, and judgment had been imperfect on all sides, and that she was prepared to apologize for a moment of poor taste. She was still even then trying to make the whole thing about a glass of wine, because a glass of wine was survivable. Caleb told her that he was not there because of the champagne. He opened the folder. He said that a person's conduct at a party after 11 o'clock was not a governance matter. What happened afterward was. Then he took the board through it, in order without raising his voice once. He laid out the restructuring memo and the 4 division heads who had been moved for reasons that did not appear in their performance records, with the numbers showing 2 of the 4 had led their segments. He laid out the transport portfolio going to Marcus Reed and the statement Marcus signed 12 days after receiving it. He laid out the meridian analysis again, this time with the section that had not been shown in the quarterly meeting, the internal correspondence in which 2 directors had asked for a second opinion on the transaction and been told in writing that the strategic review had been completed. It had not been completed. It had been returned unread with a note that strategy would be consulted when strategy was required. He laid out the licensing approaches that had never been disclosed to the counterparty file, and the ownership trace, and the signing date 18 days away, on which the company would have signed over a terminal network and a routing system worth at least $1.8 billion for $400 million. He laid out the human resources request, and the fact that it had produced nothing, and the fact that an internal matter had been opened 11 days after it produced nothing. Then he put the 4 statements on the table, including Marcus Reed's, and beside them he put a list of the people who had been present on the top floor on the night of the party. Every one of the 4 names appeared on both lists. He did not editorialize about it. He let the 2 columns sit next to each other and let the directors read across. Last he said that there were 19 seconds of video taken by 4 different phones that had circulated to something over 200 employees, and that the clip was not important as an insult. It was important because it was the moment the leadership of the company learned what was permitted. Everything that followed had been a reasonable inference from it. He told the board plainly that the party had not cost Vanessa Cole her position. What cost her the position was what she did once she believed there was no longer anyone above her. Helen Whitaker moved for an emergency vote and noted for the record that she had filed a written report on the incident weeks earlier. Richard Mercer, as chairman, put the motion. Gerald Ashford recorded it. Vanessa Cole was suspended from the office of chief executive pending a full governance investigation, with the Meridian transaction frozen immediately and referred to outside counsel for review. The vote was not close. Marcus Reed was placed under separate investigation for the decisions he had executed on her behalf and for the statement he had signed, and he was removed from the transport portfolio in the same motion. He asked to be allowed to explain and was told he would have that opportunity in writing to the investigators. Vanessa did not argue. She had been trying to construct a sentence for several minutes and had not found one that survived contact with the room. When she finally looked at Caleb, what she said was that he could have told her at any point in 2 years. Caleb answered that he could have. He said that he had wanted to know how she would treat someone she believed could not fight back, and that she had answered the question completely, and at no point had she been forced to. That was the end of the exchange, and it was the last conversation the 2 of them ever had inside that building. Afterward, in the corridor, and over the following 2 days, the apologies began. The man from legal came first, then one of the vice presidents from the windows, then a steady procession of people who had laughed on the top floor and had spent 6 weeks carefully not standing too close to him. Caleb did not ask for any of them to be fired. He could have. The board would have signed off on almost anything he requested in that particular week, and there were at least a dozen people whose behavior would have supported it. What he said when Helen asked him directly what he intended to do about them was that he did not need people who were afraid of him. He needed people who were capable of standing up when something wrong was happening in front of them. He asked Helen Whitaker to lead the governance restructuring group, and he told her why. On the night of the party, when the entire room was laughing, she had set her glass down and stayed silent, and she had been one of very few who did not join in. That was the only credential he was interested in. Helen accepted and told him that she had also gone to Vanessa privately and warned her and had failed, and that he should know that before he handed her anything. Caleb said that was the second reason he was asking her. The investigation ran for 4 months. Vanessa Cole did not return to the building. Her separation was announced in a 2-paragraph release that used the word transition, which fooled nobody who had been in the room and was not meant to. The Meridian transaction was killed. Outside counsel confirmed the ownership trace and found that the undisclosed licensing approaches would have exposed the company to a claim from its own shareholders if the sale had closed. The routing system stayed inside Sterling Crest. 2 years later, the first external licensing agreement built on it was signed at terms that made Caleb's low estimate look conservative, though by then, very few people connected the two events. Marcus Reed left in the 2nd month before the investigation reached its findings, in the way that people leave when they have read the direction of the current correctly. Richard Mercer announced his retirement that autumn. There was a press release, a photograph, and a line about 4 decades of service. He did not give a speech to the leadership team, because he had already said the only thing he had come to say on the top floor on a Thursday evening in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Caleb Mercer took control of Sterling Crest Holdings as the successor to the family block that same quarter. There was no party. That was noticed immediately and understood almost as quickly. Instead, he called the entire leadership team to the same room with the north windows, and he stood at the end of it, where Vanessa had once stood with a glass in her hand. He gave them 3 governance principles, and he gave them without preamble. No title in the company would ever sit higher than the responsibility attached to it. No employee would ever be humiliated for the entertainment of a room. And any person at any level had a standing right to object to a decision in writing, protected from retaliation if they held evidence that it would harm the company. The third one was written into the conduct policy within the week, with a reporting line that ran to Helen Whitaker's committee, rather than through the executive office, which was the entire point of it. The room was completely silent while he spoke. It was the same room, with the same view, and a significant number of the same faces. Some of them had laughed on the night of the party. Some had held up phones. Several had signed nothing, said nothing, and done nothing, and were discovering that this was its own category, and that he knew exactly which category each of them was in. He did not mention the champagne. He never mentioned it again in that room or any other. And over the following years, the people who had been present stopped waiting for him to. He closed with one line, and then he left the room. How a person treats someone they believe cannot fight back tells you who they actually are. Power does not build character. It only removes the reasons a person had for hiding the character they already possessed. Vanessa Cole did not become cruel the night she was promoted. She simply stopped needing to pretend otherwise, and everything that followed was already inside her waiting for permission. Do not measure a person's worth by their title, their appearance, or the position they happen to occupy today. The one being laughed at this evening may be the one making the decisions tomorrow, and there is rarely any warning. But that is not the real lesson, and it would be a poor one to take away. If you are kind only because the quiet person in the corner might turn out to be powerful, you have not learned anything. You have only become better at calculating. Treat people decently, not because of what they might one day be able to do to you, but because respect should never have depended on anyone's position in the first place.